Hi, I'm Christopher Anadale. I've tracked down some of my former students to ask, is there life after philosophy? Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Father Dylan Schrader, a priest of the Diocese of Jefferson City, Missouri. Father Schrader completed his philosophy studies at Conception Seminary College in 2006. He was ordained in 2010 and completed a PhD in systematic theology at the Catholic University of America in 2019. He is currently pastor of parishes in Westphalia and Folk, Missouri, and teaches regularly for the Veterum Sapientia Institute. Father Schrader, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Now, the theme of the show is life after philosophy. What have people done with their philosophy degree, their education? How has it shaped who and what they are? You've been a priest now for almost 14 years. What's your perspective on that? How has philosophy come into play in the kinds of things that you've done? Please go ahead.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, the study of philosophy, I would say, certainly contributed to the study of theology, which is one of the things it's meant to do in a Catholic context. And in a certain way, I would say I didn't really appreciate the value of philosophy until I really took the study of theology seriously and realized how important some of the foundational distinctions and patterns of thought from philosophy really could be. And so I guess the two overarching ways in which philosophy has benefited my life would be academically in being able to study theology, and then also pastorally, just in the regular parish work that I do, which is my full-time job, being a parish priest. So the first, the study of theology, when I really got into it, fell in love with it, wanted to understand the truths of our faith and how they fit together, how we can talk about God accurately and the things of God. I realized that the clarity of thought that good philosophy can provide is extremely useful in that context. So just some basic distinctions that we use all the time in theology. The distinctions between act and potency, or form and matter, being able to understand analogical language. These things are so foundational. Even something like logic and being able to follow the formal pattern of an argument is extremely important. Because I would say that there's a lot of stuff in the world of theology that is put out there that is not always very good. And if you're trying to do serious work and seriously trying to understand what do some of the things that we believe mean and how do they work, then you have to start asking these other questions, these metaphysical and these logical questions. So academically, philosophy became very important. And I actually went back and restudied a lot of the things that I was probably supposed to have learned the first time, but for whatever reason, didn't necessarily pick up or fully understand. So in that way, I would say theology became a way of applying philosophy. So you're learning things like metaphysics, but you can apply some of those same distinctions to other areas of thought. And then the other way that philosophy has been of benefit to me is pastorally. So, which maybe seems kind of surprising, but if we think that the things we believe as Catholics matter, and that even our knowledge of God matters, that impacts our life. So, an example would be this past Sunday we celebrated Trinity Sunday. And the Catechism says that the mystery of the Blessed Trinity is the central mystery of Christian faith and life. So it matters what we believe about God. It matters whether we believe things that are accurate about God or not. And that should affect how we live, you know? And people don't always think that way because we tend to separate the intellectual content of our faith from just how we do things on a day-to-day basis. But in a parish setting, you can really see how it makes a huge difference, especially in areas like moral theology, sacramental theology, and so forth. So an example could be some of the controversies about the celebration of sacraments that have come up in the last few years. So the formula for baptism, for example.
Right.
the controversy over, can I say we baptize you versus I baptize you? And well, that makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference to someone's life, whether they're baptized or not. And that's a question about semiotics. It's a question about the causal efficacy of the sacraments and all sorts of things. So the distinctions that we can learn from philosophy, I would say, have helped me to apply some of those sort of things in a practical level, in my parish work as well.
It seems there can be a kind of divide, though, between the philosophy that leads you deeper into theology and allows you to make distinctions like, act and potency and form and matter, and talk about causal efficacy of sacraments and their necessary conditions and the like. And then the work of preaching and of being a pastor, which in a sense goes almost in the opposite direction, not more academic, not more intellectual, but deeper into the way that people live their lives and the vocabulary, the conceptual vocabulary they use in conducting themselves, which seems, one, not to be terribly philosophical at all, and to the extent that it is, seems to be working with a very different set of philosophical categories and assumptions. How do you bridge that gap? Do you see the pastor as a kind of philosophical educator, or is he somebody who has to have a foot in both worlds and to be able to speak both languages and translate between them, so to speak?
Yeah, in my experience, it varies depending on what kind of community you're in. So I have to learn from whatever community I'm assigned to, what their lives are like, what kind of people are living here, what their experiences are, how they speak, and things like that. And so I have to be educated in that because I may come from a different background. So in a certain setting, you might have people who are perhaps better academically trained than the pastor is in theology or philosophy or even canon law or whatever it is. And so that's a very different environment from being in a place where the pastor is the perhaps only person who's educated in ecclesiastical things. It could be a whole spectrum. So yeah, there is learning how to bridge that gap. And I would say one of the faults that I have is a tendency to rely on technical language because it's easier. Once you get used to thinking of things in certain terms, it becomes much easier to think of those things in those terms, which is why we have jargon and technical terms to begin with. And then trying to find a way where you can express those ideas that is somewhat accurate, even if not using the precise language, can be difficult. So that's a challenge for preaching. It's a challenge for just talking with people when you're trying to answer what are really deep questions, but in a way that may be understandable. So I think that was something that C.S. Lewis noted, maybe in one of his essays or one of his letters. He talked about how uh, teachers have a tendency to be obsessed with problems that students don't have because they want to answer the questions they think the students should have rather than the questions that they do have. So that is a challenge.
Reminds me of a conversation I've had with my wife in the past, even about our work, both of us being, I guess, educators of a certain kind, I in college and she in homeschool, that the problem of a person who chooses and uses words very precisely with a lot of care, communicating with and among people who don't necessarily have that same discipline. And it feels sometimes frustrating on both sides trying to communicate. Is that it seems like theology should bring some clarity to that, but it's always going to be a bit of a struggle, it seems.
It can be. This is especially the case on social media. So anyone who's involved with talking about Catholic things on social media, I realized this at some point that a lot of these folks they don't mean what I think they mean. What they seem to be asserting is not what they're asserting. So, for example, someone who says, this baptism or this mass is not valid. By valid, they might mean okay. They might mean that it went the way it was supposed to go overall. Whereas in the language of theology and canon law, valid means something very specific. It means that it produces the effect it's supposed to produce. So something could have all sorts of problems and be totally valid, which doesn't mean it's legitimate or illicit. It just means that it accomplished the thing it was supposed to accomplish. So there are a lot of things that I've had to learn to be on the lookout there, to not to presume certain meanings necessarily, because otherwise you'll have people saying things like, you know, I went to mass and this thing happened, therefore it wasn't valid, and you might want to charge them with heresy, but they're not really a heretic. They're just saying, well, this shouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be totally right about that.
Right. People just say things, as a friend of mine says. They just say things sometimes without clear thinking behind it. Let me ask you about Latin, if I may, since this is another one of those issues that goes with a certain kind of vocabulary and a certain kind of conceptual framework. You're one of the people I know who's sort of most deeply immersed in the study of the Latin language, and you do some regular instruction with the institute I mentioned at the beginning. What's the sort of role of Latin been in your priesthood and in your ministry generally?
It's been of tremendous benefit. Of all the things I've done in life, choosing to learn Latin, I think, has been one of the most life-changing, one of the most significant, which is not something I would have expected necessarily, but it's it's something that I use every day. It's unbelievable, really, what kinds of advantages Latin offers to someone who's in the world that I'm in, who's an ecclesiastic, who's a parish priest, things like that. So I'll give some examples. So one example is simply the fact that most of Catholic thought in the West that is preserved for us is preserved in Latin. So Latin is not a magical language. Sometimes people want to treat it as if it descended from on high or something. It's a regular human language. What gives it its, I would say, sacred and significant quality is the fact that in God's providence, it's simply the language that has been used for the majority of church history in the West. So this means that most of what Catholics thought and said up until very, very recently has been preserved for us in Latin. So we have access to all these things that are available. So a classic example would be the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this was a crisis for so many reasons. People died, people got sick. One of the things the church had to struggle with was, how do we respond to this? What kinds of restrictions do we place or not place? How do we administer sacraments or not administer them? And it's in so many questions. Well, this is not the first time the church has confronted a pandemic. So there are, from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, writings that go into great detail about very practical ways of responding to situations like this, in terms of, well, what can be done with the sacraments where they'll still be valid and still be done in a reverent way, but where we can administer them while taking precautions to avoid contagion and things like that. So simply being able to open up one of those manuals or one of those treatises and read, well, how did people respond to this in the past? That had immediate, tremendous impact, and it helped me responding in just a parish setting to be able to know, well, what sorts of things might I do or might I not do in administering the sacraments in a time of pandemic. So that was one example. Questions about very practical things in moral theology or in sacramental theology, these things come up all the time. Being able to read some of the old treatises and manuals is very helpful, because a lot of those were written as reference works for just regular parish priests. And so they were not meant to be the exhaustive explanation of everything, but simply a reference book that you can go back to and look up, well, what's a reasonable way to approach this particular situation? So Latin is very practical in that respect. One of the things that I have thought about a lot in catechesis is the influence of Latin vocabulary on English, because a lot of our words for technical things that we teach to children come from Latin. And I'm not saying we shouldn't teach them, but sometimes it can be helpful to explain their meaning. So a great example is act of contrition. So we teach our kids the phrase act of contrition at the age of 6 or 7. It's a very strange thing to say in English. It makes sense if you know what contrition is and if you know what an act is, but we don't really speak that way very much anymore. So there are a lot of things like that where it can be helpful to try to put it into a more contemporary English mode of expression. So act of contrition is simply an expression of sorrow. Act just means an expression. Contrition means sorrow. So the kids understand that a little bit better. But it's interesting because the English theological vocabulary is very small compared to the Latin theological vocabulary. And so if terms exist in English, they're usually borrowed from Latin, but sometimes they don't exist at all because distinctions that were made haven't been made in people writing in English. So sometimes you have to go back to Latin for those things to be able to see more clearly what the thinking process actually was and some of the theologians that have used that language.
Do you think Latin has shaped the way that you think? Do you think in a certain way because of the study of Latin?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's hard to give an example of that off the top of my head, but I have no doubt that it has. One of the things perhaps that I would say Latin has done, besides being able to read these different resources and things, is to force me to think more precisely about what it is that I mean, and to try to avoid ambiguity that can easily creep in. Really, the study of grammar would actually help with a lot of that. So some of it is not Latin per se. Some of it is simply the study of grammar and being able to understand how words are functioning in a sentence. That lends itself to a clarity of thought that goes hand in hand with logic, being able to understand how inference works and what forms are valid, what forms are not valid, and so forth. But Latin offers, like the study of any other language. When you study a second or a third language, you learn things in your own native language that are ambiguous that you didn't think were ambiguous, and things that are clearer than in the other language, and so forth, because languages just deal with things differently. So it is interesting and helpful from that perspective, just the clarity of thought that it kind of forces upon you. One thing I will add is that I think the loss of Latin as a practical language in the church is a terrible loss, and I don't think people realize how bad it is. Those who are most interested in Latin tend to be interested in the liturgical aspect of it, which is also important in its own right. But in the last 10 to 15 years, the shift from using Latin on a global level in the Catholic Church to essentially not using it at all is huge. So even something like the fact that the encyclical letter Lumen Fidei came out in Latin when it was released, and now we don't get Latin texts of important documents at all, I think is going to cause us tremendous problems for several reasons. One is that the church is a global community. So when people are arguing literally about a single word or a single phrase and what it means, you have to have a standard text. You can't argue about what a text means until you know what the text is. So if we don't have a standardized text, we're in a lot of trouble. Second is that the church is a community that is going to last a long time. So the fact that we're producing things today that we essentially expect to be totally discarded 200 years from now maybe tells us something about the kind of work that we're doing. Do we want Catholics of, the future to be able to read the things that we're putting out? And if not, why not? It's much more likely that Catholics in 1,000 years are going to be able to read Latin than they are going to be able to read any of the modern languages as they exist right now. So it's crazy to cut ourselves off from the past and the future in this way.
Hmm. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I've wondered recently about, issues of authoritative texts, whether you would regard the Italian text in which something is released, or the Spanish text, which presumably is the current pope's native language, or the Latin text, which might be a translation from one or both of them by someone other than the author, perhaps. Where does the authority come from? So I take your point very much as regards the importance of some of these some of the textual debates that might take place.
Yeah, it's important to establish that. And it depends ultimately on the intention of the one having authority. So it's not that Latin was the only language ever used. It simply is the majority language. But popes in the past have issued encyclical letters in other languages as well. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that an encyclical letter used to be a real letter. So it was a personal letter to someone or to the bishops or so forth. And today it's more like a general teaching document. So it's whatever language or whatever form of the text the person having authority wishes to assign to it. So one of the issues we have now is the lack of clarity about that, partly because of the internet and the desire to release things as quickly as possible in multiple languages, which has its own advantages, and I can understand that. But the official publication of text lags years behind. And so the debate about a text will go on for months and even years before there is an official version of it. This happened with Amoris Laetitia, for example. It took a long time for that to be published in the official version, but the discussion was well underway by that point. Now, this also means that when the Holy See or whatever authority issues a text, they can sort of do a soft release of it, see what the reaction is, and then tinker with the official version if they want to. Famously, something like this happened intentionally with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where the French text was put out in 1992 for discussion, which was a very good move because it allowed a lot of people to give feedback on it. And then in 1997, the official Latin version of the book came out.
Well, that is interesting. So yeah, we do live certainly in a time where you've got to worry about not just instantaneous distribution, but also there's multiple languages and official and unofficial versions. Another question about Latin. Do you think it's possible for any parish priest or for a determined layman to acquire enough knowledge of Latin in the ordinary course of things without an academic study to make a difference in their lives?
I think it's possible. It's possible for most people. It's like anything else, it just takes time. So time is a valuable resource, and many of us may not have a lot of it. But the most important thing is just consistency. So a little bit every day over the course of several years will show measurable improvement. The Veterum Sapientia Institute is using very modern language methods that are proven to be most effective for most people. So that is the resource I would recommend for any Catholics in the United States who want to learn Latin. The Veterum Sapientia Institute is the place to go to right now, and I hope that it grows and that other endeavors also continue to grow. But it is possible, and there are, in fact, more, in a certain sense, more resources than ever before. On the other hand, we also have disadvantages that we didn't have before. People are less able or less willing to give time to this sort of thing. So the busyness of the modern world and all the distractions and things that are out there, that's a big disadvantage for us. But a little bit every day can make a difference.
That's great. That's good to hear. I'll include a link to the institute in the show notes, the description for this episode. One final question, if you don't mind, and this is something although I've interviewed several priests for this podcast, I've never asked a direct question about this, and I hope you don't mind my asking you. What's been the role of philosophy formation, education, sort of ongoing philosophical understanding with regard to the discipline of celibacy? Since that's an important part of priestly identity and sort of one that is under more focus and more attention in recent decades in our own place and time. Is there a certain philosophical anthropology that you feel you've gotten from your philosophy study? Is there a certain kind of necessary understanding of virtues at the natural level that you think really helps with both the understanding and the living out of that charism?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I've thought explicitly about the role of formal study of philosophy with regard to celibacy before, but there certainly is a role there. The philosophical and theological anthropology involved is key. It's absolutely key, and it would be key to any human being trying to live their life in a good way. But I would say the Catholic teaching that the soul is the form of the body, and which has all sorts of there's a whole theological aspect to that can be built up as well. But even on the natural level, just understanding that the human being is one thing, is not two things. We're a certain kind of rational animal, and that means that the way we live, our animality makes a difference. And people today sort of want to have it both ways. The body doesn't matter, or it's all that matters. It's totally contradictory. And the church has wisely defended a sort of virtuous mean between that the body matters. It's not all that there is to the person, but precisely for that reason, it actually has a greater significance, that there's an element or an aspect of us that is greater than the body, but which itself informs the body. So the same thing that makes me able to know and to love God is the thing that makes me alive and able to eat and drink and grow and things like that. So that has great implications for sexuality and for the discipline of celibacy, because it means that the body is the body of a person. It means that sexuality has to have moral implications. There's no way it can't have moral implications. If we're animals, that means that the things that animals do are things that we do and that we can choose to do and choose not to do. And so that means that those choices make a difference. So if we think about the immortality of the soul, then we can say, well, okay, how do I live my life with a view toward that? Just even on the natural level. When you add the Christian faith to that, then if we believe grace elevates nature, then these kind of natural questions sort of cross a new horizon. So celibacy becomes a question of sort of a a commitment of one's sexuality, specifically a foregoing of marriage, for the sake of the kingdom of God. So there's always got to be, I think, a supernatural element for this to really make sense in a Christian context. Although I could see on a natural level, maybe as a radical expression of the virtue of continence, people sort of being able to recognize there's something there. I actually have thought about this a little bit in terms of pop culture, that in a world that doesn't really value celibacy and seems perplexed by it, there's still a sort of traces of a recognition that there's something there, even in pop culture. So anytime, not anytime, but sometimes in movies or in comic books or in novels, when you have a man who is set apart for something beyond the ordinary world, you have something like an expression of celibacy. So a great example would be in the movie Men in Black, when they're on the bench and they're having the conversation about, does Will Smith want to join the Men in Black or not? And he realizes that he has to give up basically everything, that he has to give up family. He has to give up all these things. And he wonders, is it worth it or not? That's kind of an interesting expression of that. Originally, the Jedi in Star Wars, they're devoted to a kind of celibacy and things like that. There's a lot of examples like that where there's this idea that if you're in touch with something beyond the merely natural level, it's fitting that you would embrace a kind of continence or celibacy. I would say, personally, from my perspective, two images have made the most sense to me in terms of celibacy for priests. And one is liturgical and one is military, and they're both in scripture. So the liturgical aspect is the idea that by offering divine sacrifice on behalf of the community, we're in touch with something beyond the current world. We're in touch with the transcendent. And so while marriage is good, it's a good for this world. And it's appropriate that we sort of, enter into this eschatological or transcendent element so fully that for the sake of divine worship, we'd be separated from that. So you find that in Exodus, when the people have to abstain from sexual relations, when the covenant is being given, when sacrifice is being offered. We find that with David and his men when they eat the bread of the presence, things like that. The other element is military. So this is also in sacred scripture. When soldiers are on campaign, they have to separate themselves from family life for the sake of mission, and I think that has a great significance for priests as well, that essentially we're always on campaign. And so to my mind, those sorts of images have been very helpful. Behind that is a theological anthropology that takes the body seriously, takes the soul seriously, recognizes that the human being has an eternal destiny, recognizes that celibacy is only good because marriage is good, not because marriage is bad, because marriage is good. And then sort of anyway, I sort of rambling here, but it's a fascinating question. I think a lot could be said about it.
I appreciate a very thoughtful and very thorough answer to that question, which I did, in fairness, I did surprise you with. I'm very grateful for that. I especially like the phrase "living our animality." That fits in with some things that I do as a regular teacher of Aristotelian ethics. I talk often about the bringing our drives and our appetites and instincts under the rule of reason, which doesn't mean replacing them. It doesn't mean dominating them, but it means giving them a certain kind of natural perfection that can only come from being incorporated into the rational life, the life of a rational animal, and not merely an animal.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's exactly right. So the development of habit is so important, and that's something that as a parish priest, I have learned more and more over the years that I go back to, and I talk to my people constantly about this. I was just talking to the parents of the first communion children, saying your kids are going to learn habits related to the Eucharist, whether you like it or not. They're going to learn the habit of going to mass or the habit of not going to mass. There's no neutrality. There's really no practical neutrality here. So you have to help them develop good habits, because for a lot of people, most of the time, the way we actually act is an expression of the habits we formed, which leads to a certain development of character. We become the things we repeatedly do in a certain sense. And so people might even have strong faith, but if they don't have practical habits of living that faith, they don't get where they need to be. The thing I would add about living our animality, it reminds me of something St. Thomas says, where St. Thomas is talking about human sexuality, and he's dealing with an objection that this is sort of like this irrational thing, and he says, well, certainly there are perversions of it, and that makes us more like the beasts, but in itself, this is part of who we are, and so when it's elevated by reason and further by grace, by reason operating under grace, the animal element is not negated. It's actually made more itself in a certain sense, because human animality is always rational animality. So it's like St. Paul says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it for the glory of God. We don't become less animals by becoming filled with grace and living by reason. We become more the kind of animals we're supposed to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great place for us to stop, and I think we're almost at the end of our time here. So I really appreciate you being on the podcast today. Our guest has been Father Dylan Schrader, a priest of the Diocese of Jefferson City, Missouri, and a Latin scholar. Thank you so much, Father.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.